Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Laguna Woods Democratic Club's monthly meeting. I'm Susan Deering, the president of the club. I'm happy that you could all join us here today. I'd like to thank Pat Leftwich for helping with the recording. I'd like to thank Rebecca Gilad, who will be doing the questions at the end. I'd like to thank Jean Lepowski, who's doing our moment of reflection. And most of all, I'd like to thank our speaker for today, who is Reverend Dr. Charles Dorsey. And he will be speaking on We Got Problems, an unpopular but unnecessary conversation. And he will cover the topics of racism, reparations, and Jim Crow laws. I would like to thank our member, Fran Williams, for connecting us with Reverend Dr. Dorsey. And I would be remiss if I didn't say that this is, we are currently in February, which is Black History Month, even though this show will be aired in March. And we at the Democratic Club want to remember Black history, not just during February, but throughout the year. And because of that, we have a committee called the Laguna Woods Democratic Club African American Committee. And one of the projects that we are doing is a program called Black in Laguna Woods. And so far we have done 3 programs of interviews with Black residents of Laguna Woods. Those are half-an-hour programs, and they are moderated by Alan Feldman, our secretary, and they have been showing once a week for the past 3 months on Laguna Woods television. And we do have one for March. And so please, you can catch that. I'm not sure if the timing will be the same. It has been at 5:30 on Thursdays. So thank you for joining us, and welcome everyone. And now I would like to introduce Jean Lepowski, who will do our moment of reflection. We decided to do a very brief moment of reflection on all our meetings, with something about Black Lives Matter, and the recognition that many of us who are white and not Black do not have a good understanding of what it means to be Black. And so we're just going to present something very short, something for you to reflect on and think about, perhaps in the days to come after this program is over. Thank you, Jean.
The Black Lives Matter movement started back in 2013, but became very well known this year because of the multiple protests that were inspired by the murder of George Floyd. I've heard people ask quite often, why don't we just say all lives matter? Because of course it's true that all lives matter. But we say Black Lives Matter because all didn't cover Black when they said all men are created equal. We say Black Lives Matter because all didn't cover Black when they said with liberty and justice for all. We say Black Lives Matter because there are still people struggling with the definition of all.
Now I'd like to introduce our speaker, Reverend Dr. Charles Dorsey. And Reverend Dorsey has over 15 years of service at COR-AME Church. He has a doctorate in organizational leadership from Pepperdine University. He has been honored as an outstanding community leader by Orange County Human Relations Commission, and also by 100 Black Men. He's an accomplished author, vocalist, and has had over 300 speaking engagements. And we are very pleased to welcome him today.
Thank you so much for having me. I want to shout out the Democratic Club all the way in Orange County, but certainly nestled right in Laguna Hills. I'm happy to be here. Thank you, Susan, for that introduction. And I just got to say a couple of names before I begin. I see you, Dr. Donna. I would dare not come up in here and not shout you out. God bless you. I certainly must mention the majestic name of Dr. Fran. You guys might know her as Dr. Williams. Anybody who had anything to do with this is a significant opportunity at a significant time in our country and in all of our individual lives. Some of the words that have been used to describe this moment are unprecedented. And I think that the courage to gather under this theme at this time to discuss this topic is one that hopefully we won't forget in the near future. I also want to celebrate the leadership of Reverend Dr. Mark Whitlock and First Lady Whitlock, who continue to be trailblazers in our country and in our church. It is because of their seeds and the time that they spent that I get opportunities to walk in their shoes. And of course, all who have poured in. Now, I don't take it for granted that I get an opportunity to speak to people like yourselves, people who have watched our country over time, people who have longevity on this planet, and people who have many lessons and have seen many things. And so I, as an upcoming activist, I, as a voice of influence, really don't take it for granted when I get an opportunity to have an audience like this. And so I ask your permission to offer critical thought, but also speak directly to some of the things that I think are really appropriate. Today, we're going to discuss under the theme, We Got Problems. And it is true that we got problems. And I want to base my commentary in a very, very short portion of a well-known piece of literature called Souls of Black Folk, penned by our very own W.E.B. Du Bois. He is a scholar, one of the first African-American PhDs to graduate from Harvard. Not necessarily the first African-American PhD, because that person actually graduated from Yale. And there's a great story behind that. But believe it or not, that particular African-American got their doctorate degree in physics of all things. And for that to be, and it was actually one of 6 doctorate degrees ever offered in that topic. And we celebrate that trailblazing effort. But he is also an author. He is also an activist. He is also somebody who cut his teeth trying to fight for the rights of African-American people in the United States. And so I decided to consult his popular text as the framework for our conversation today. And I think that that's going to create a framework to discuss racism, to discuss reparations, to discuss Jim Crow laws. And it's important to understand that this book was penned in the early 1900s. And so it is penned at a time that is well acquainted with racism, and certainly that moves through and survives Jim Crow laws and is now a seminal work in many of our seminaries and many of our colleges, and certainly on the bookshelves of those who consider themselves to be well-informed or conscious about the work of African Americans and the life of African Americans in the United States. If you'd allow me to read just a brief snippet of this book, it's right at the beginning, and it reads, "Between me and the other world, there is ever an unasked question, unasked by some through feelings of delicacy, by others through the difficulty of rightly framing it. All, nevertheless, flutter around it. They approach me in a half-hesitant sort of way, eye me curiously or compassionately, and then, instead of saying directly, 'How does it feel to be a problem?' they say, 'I know an excellent colored man in my town.' Or they say, 'I fought at Mechanicsville, or they say, do not these Southern outrages make your blood boil? And at these I smile or am interested, or reduce the boiling to a simmer as the occasion may require. But to the real question, how does it feel to be a problem? I answer seldom a word. I want to read that last sentence for your consideration. To the real question, how does it feel to be a problem? I answer seldom a word. We got problems, but I want to start at the proposition that this should not be a mystery to any of us. If we are in a position to have a conversation about reparations, and if after centuries we're still talking about eradicating racism, if there are words that surface in our conversation like white supremacy, injustice, if people are still dealing with inequity as it relates to gender pay, if we're still having conversation around why certain groups in our country are treated differently than other groups, I just think it's important to realize that these voices that have spoken to this translate over years, which makes this very old text relevant today. It's penned in a book called The Souls of Black Folk. The souls. I think most of us would agree that the issues that we're facing as it relates to reparations and racism and systematic oppression should hit us at the soul level. Indeed, if this is not something that makes it difficult to sleep, we got problems. If you can just wake up every day and feel happy about the position that you're in, because in our privileged state, each one of us wakes up in a warm place, some of us feeling more safe than others. If there is no dinner table conversation, if we can just watch images pass across the screen casually without feeling some disruption at the soul level, I think we've got a problem. And I think that W.E.B. Du Bois was prophetic and definitely timely when he named it the souls of Black folk, because all of these issues are not just an attack on a person's body, but they're an attack on the person's soul. I don't know how long you've been watching conversations about justice, but it is true that there are some issues in our country that are warring for the soul of our country. And we believe that racism and reparations and the injustice that has been imputed upon African Americans is indeed an assault on the soul. So let's just start there, that this is a soul issue, that we ought to be feeling it so deep that we can't just live ordinary lives, that even at our advanced and seasoned ages, we ought feel compelled to lift our voices or go to the fight or find our contribution to justice efforts. It's a soul conversation. And indeed, he starts the book and titles his first chapter on spiritual strivings. He articulates that this is a goal at the spirit level. That is what we see in our reading today. He talks about an encounter that he was having and how people have difficulty conversing with him about the issues going on in our country. And I would suggest to us today that this is where the work has to begin, and that we have to call out the depth of the issue with whoever we're conversing with. That we have to tell them that this is bigger than money, it's bigger than land. That's why we've got to have a conversation about reparations, because it is difficult to implement soul reparation. Are you hearing what I'm saying? It is difficult to implement soul reparation. How do you give back to the soul something that was robbed when you castrated daddy in front of kids? Something that was robbed when you made it impossible for communities to get access to resources if their family was intact. How is it that you give reparations to the soul? This is a dilemma that all of us face. And it is true that tangible things like money and houses and land don't necessarily restore the soul. And this is why all of us have to be convinced that our work is not just for the tangible, but that we have to speak to and address and fight for and advocate on behalf of the soul. We have to interrogate our own souls. We have to ask ourselves, what is it in me that is not responsive to the assault that has happened on these people? The problem is we don't do this enough. We got real problems because we have sometimes added insult to injury because we've limited our advocacy to the tangible. Let me go a little deeper though. Because the conversation or the text that we read introduces the dilemma that people have speaking with him because they don't know how to have the conversation. So then this is now the speech level. They don't know how to talk about the issue. Isn't this why we have convened this conversation today, to get more language? I mean, we have been emboldened by movements like the Black Lives Matter, and we've been emboldened by people's daring to call out white supremacy, to say words like injustice, to get on the floor of some of the highest places in our country and demand that we reject and renounce white supremacy. Unfortunately, everybody can't do that. But we have now introduced language, but it is still difficult for us to have the conversation. And I would suggest that many of us still have trouble when we're having conversations with our African-American brothers and sisters because we don't know what we can say and what we cannot say. And yet in the early 1900s, our brother and our scholar and our professor, Dr. Du Bois, was frustrated by the same thing because everybody knew there was an issue, but nobody knew how to talk about it. Isn't that a problem? When we've been facing something for over a century, but we still don't know how to have the conversation. There's a great term that I'd like to introduce to you at this time. It is called white fragility, because some people then have difficulty broaching the conversation about the injustices and about racism. In fact, they don't even like to mention the word racism. They like to use words like, prejudice, lack of inclusion, inequity. You know, we come up with these other words, but the truth is the root of it is the hate driven by racism. We don't like talk about it because we don't know how to have the conversation. And so WB was talking about how the length that people go to just to have the conversation with him. We can't even have reparation conversations because most of us don't have the language. Like, where do we start? I know I'm not the only one that has walked into rooms and found myself struggling to find the words. And it really sways on a spectrum depending on the faces that are looking back at me. It is true that some people, even in speech, will change their body posture depending on the words that you use. We can't say that white skin equals privilege without making somebody uncomfortable, without them having to rebut, because this is the frustration that comes along with the speech saying, well, I had a tough upbringing too. I digress though. And so he introduces the reality that part of the problem that we have is people don't know how to talk to us about the issue. And he inserts a very valuable question here because he translates their attempt to this particular phrase that he believes they should just go ahead and ask. He believes that it's appropriate if we're going to have a conversation with African Americans about racism and reparations and about some of the Jim Crow laws, that part of the conversation has to start with, how does it feel to be a problem? Oh, I could take a turn here and talk about those of us who have been in conversations. And the truth is, the issue isn't the problem. The person is the problem. I don't have time to go there, but I want to suggest that one of the problems is in the types of conversation that we have. And I want to embolden us to practice and have more courage to understand that we have not evolved to a place where we know how to have the conversation. And just because you can say Black versus saying African-American, or just because you have some Black friends that have allowed you to surface your concern for the issue, does not mean that you have arrived at the expertise level to be able to have this conversation. And I would caution us about how we go into the conversation, that we might not cause more injury. I realize that my time is short, so let me move on to the next level, because this is also an issue of awareness. It is true that many of us have heard people get over loud microphones and suggest, I didn't perpetuate this onto your people. Can you hear the frustration in my voice? When a person who has benefited from a lineage of oppression comes and says, well, I didn't do it. That wasn't me. And therefore, I'm not responsible for it. And yet in everyday lives, people have permission to look at me and then compare me to the actions and behavior of someone that looks like me. And through that, they administrate their engagement with me as a consequence, not of my actions, but the actions of someone who looked like me. So we actually understand how to make our decisions based on associating someone with an encounter or someone who looks like them. We know how to do that, but when that is then reversed and then given back to them, we must rise up and resist it to say, well, that wasn't me. I should be treated based on my performance alone. Mm-hmm. And yet in our medical fields, we look at the history of our parents and our grandparents in order to make assessments about what we should caution people about today. And when we look at people who we want to hire on the job, we ask for employment history. When we look at people who we want, some of us are staying in rental property. And one of the questions that they ask on the application is, rental history. When we try to get access to resources, they want to know economic history. And yet, when we look at this conversation about racism and reparations, we want to be given a clean slate. This is an issue of awareness now, because some people don't even realize what the issue is. And so WEB says that they're talking to him, but they're not truly aware of the issue. So they talk around it. They try to find ways to build community because they don't know necessarily where they stand in the conversation. It is awareness. They're blind to the injury. I know I'm not the only one who has had conversations with people who have no clue. Had somebody come up to you and say, I don't know why they're so upset. I don't know why this is such a big issue. I can't understand why they're doing all of this resistance, this peaceful assembly. I don't know. I just can't understand. I mean, don't they have schools? Don't they have jobs? I mean, don't they have houses? I mean, what is the big issue? It's an awareness issue. Some people are still not well versed on Jim Crow and its legacy. I'll tell you a quick story that happened to me on some streets that you might be familiar with. I was driving up a street called Moulton. Mm-hmm. And I got to another street, I think called Laguna Hills Parkway. I'm driving up the street. I'm driving a brand new car. Because some of you know that when you live in affluent areas, new cars is kind of normal. The cars that don't have license plates. Yeah, the cars that have fresh fragrances. They have stickers on them that notify everybody who sees the vehicle that is new. So I'm traveling up the highway in my new car. And guess what new cars don't have? License plates. Now, here it is where a police officer drives by me and passes me. And then after passing me, decides to slow up. Now, I think they slowed up because they saw who was driving. They say they slowed up because my car didn't have a license plate. I say, okay, let's just go further than this. They pulled me over. Well, I didn't know that. I just, when a police officer passes by you, for those of you who don't have this experience, the first thing that most people of color, and particularly African-American men do, is we check our speed, we check our seatbelt, we check everything, because we don't want to have an encounter with the police enforcement in any way. Anyways, they slow down, they get behind me, they pull me over, and before they get to my car, I comply, they draw down. Now, if you've never had a weapon drawn on you, this is hard to imagine. Here I am in my new car. So I immediately roll down the window, let me hurry on. And I put my hands out the window. And I put my head down. I put my hands out the window and I put my head down. I sacrifice dignity that I might see the next moment. They pull me out of the car. They never check. They never see my license, driver's license. At the end of the encounter, after detaining me, meaning putting my hands behind my back and sitting me on a curb in a city that I serve, they say, we wanted to make sure somebody got their car back. This is the explanation. And I then find myself enraged. Because I say, clearly, I've served enough here. I've poured into this community enough. I've trained the officers about how to speak to and dialogue with and build relationship with people who look like me. And I'm still at gunpoint for driving a new car. And I don't think that these officers lost sleep over it because they probably didn't have an awareness that would suggest that automatically that triggered centuries of pent-up injustice. And so this awareness issue, let me press on so that I can move us to our closing thoughts. And so now it is the WEB, he said, to the question, right? Because there were other questions that were posed just to try to have a conversation with him about what's going on in the country. And what they were saying one thing, but he heard, hey, how does it feel to be a problem? They were saying one thing, he heard, how does it feel to be a problem? He said he rarely answers that question. Now, I want to deal very quickly with the reality that sometimes the people who are trying to do good and trying to get access to allies, trying to build relationships with African Americans, I got to notify you, sometimes you don't get the response. Because the fatigue of trying to explain to people what the injury is sometimes silences voices. We have to ask ourselves questions like, is this person conscious enough for me to even be honest with them about what they're actually doing? Should I give my energy to someone who has no clue what's going on? I have a good friend who explained to me, and I agree with this, and this is a moment of clarity. It is a labor every time you have to explain to someone. It is a labor. It means I am giving, I am contributing, I am exhausting resource every time I have to explain conversations around racism, reparations, Jim Crow. I have to explain to them how we couldn't walk on the same sidewalks or use the same bathrooms. I have to explain to them how Jim Crow has gotten more sophisticated. And you should read Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow. And it talks about how the sophistication of the laws has improved. So we just seen this in one of our recent elections where we're we're fighting over affirmative action, where it is that some people are like, I don't want the leg up, but I should be given preference. And there is this fight because Jim Crow has now translated into ceilings and barriers that continue to keep people outside of opportunity to climb out of poverty and climb out of discrimination and climb out of the low class that they inherited as a consequence of their families' encounter with previous Jim Crow administration, where it is then legal to push people to the margins and make them live there, where it is a risk to your life to seek equal rights. This is why the All Lives Matter conversation is so frustrating, by the way, because if you can't see that most of the injustice has become institutionalized, where it is that they even have the nerve now to prop a Black face as a gatekeeper in organizations to say, well, you choose your people, because that's the best we can do. You know, they have what are these positions called? Directors of Diversity and Inclusion. Y'all may not know this, but I call them gatekeepers sometimes, because now you got to go through somebody that looks like you to get access to the equity. Because it's easier to disguise Jim Crow when you're getting resistance and pushback from somebody who looks like you. Because we can hide our prejudice policies and we can continue to leave people outside if it comes from someone who looks like that. So W.E.B. Du Bois says, I don't respond often. And so now for those who really want to have the conversation, they've got to prove themselves trustworthy to receive some of the feedback. We got problems, right? The problems are at the soul level, the conversation level, the awareness level, and the response level. Let me give you this and then I'm done. It's at the S level, it's at the C level, it's at the A level, and it's at the R level. Let me say it again. Hopefully you got it. It's at the S level, the C level, the A level, and the R level. And what does that spell? Scar. There are scars. I dare introduce Christian imagery where it is that Jesus says, look at my hands. There you will discover the trauma of nails being put through them. Mm-hmm. Look at my scars. And some people don't realize that you've got to be able to deal with some of the evidence of the scars that have been accumulated along this path. We got problems, but I love what W.E.B. does. The truth is, he was a problem. He absolutely was. He was a problem because in the midst of Jim Crow, in the midst of racism, he was still alive and thriving. He was the problem. And so the fact that you see the Democratic group fighting and standing on behalf of those who have been mistreated, the fact that Black History Month still continues to be heralded as an opportunity for us to celebrate Black excellence, the fact that people are surviving the threat on their lives on a daily basis and climbing places of influence, that's a problem, but it's a good problem. And so I'm just here to knock on the door of some of my fellow troublemakers who have been creating good trouble, like our dearly beloved John Lewis, and say that if you're not a problem, you should be. That continuing to show up in your brilliance and your excellence, continuing to leverage your experience and stand up against injustice, continuing to divide and defy some of the statistics and some of the stereotypes that come along with your skin, that's a problem that we need. It's a necessary problem because it frustrates some of the outcomes that have been predicted based on the racism and the reparations and the Jim Crow laws that have existed. I'm hoping that all of my problem children will rise up in this day and at this time and continue to fight the good fight. So I'll close there. Thank you guys for the opportunity to have a conversation about problems. I've given you enough, hopefully, there for you to do some reflecting. But to those people who are a problem, you were not expected to get where you are. You're expected to be mute and wounded and down and burdened, but you're shining and you're emboldened and you're fighting and you're pressing forward. I'm here for it. God bless you and keep going. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Reverend Dr. Dorsey. You certainly have given us a lot to think about, and especially I liked the scar image, and I liked realizing that we all need to think every day about the importance of history and how that history cannot be erased. We do have some questions, and Rebecca Gallad will pose those questions to you now. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Hi, Dr. Reverend Dorsey. I don't know if to applaud or cry or what. This was extraordinary. Thank you.
Thank you.
So if I cry, I'm sorry.
That's fine.
First question. Does this moment have the same moral force as the mid-1960s, which at least legally moved things forward? Does George Floyd equal Selma?
Yeah, this is a very, very significant question. It is really difficult to juxtapose or compare the times just because the state of our people is just, it just looks differently. I think that when we are looking at the Selma experience, which I should tell you, my cousin, I figured out my cousin was one of Dr. King's bodyguards. If you've seen the movie Selma, there's this guy in the film called Big O. His name is James Orange. James Orange is my cousin. He has memorials built throughout Atlanta. And if you see him everywhere Dr. King was, it was this big guy. That was one of his bodyguards, happened to be my cousin. Huge guy, good God, he was 6 foot plus and weighed a lot. So their work, I think, deserves its own pedestal. I do think that we're at a time in our world, and I can't say country because George Floyd initiated a global resistance. It was global unrest. And I think that this is part of Dr. King's dream, because if you study Dr. King really closely, you'll discover that he studied Gandhi, a global figure. So he comes up from under that teaching and he dares take religious peace traditions and sync them up in a way that gives birth to a civil rights, nonviolent protest movement, right? And so I think that we're at that level of expression of the resistance. So where it is that now the spirits of our forebearers and all of the different communities of color has culminated in unrest. So I think that this unrest has the potential to be one of those historic moments that we put up on the wall next to Selma, but absolutely different. I think that also there are some conversations that are happening at the policy and legislative level that we can't really appreciate now. One of the things that they don't talk about enough is when Dr. King was doing his work, everybody didn't support him. It became popular to support him after he died. Y'all know I'm telling the truth now, because everybody wasn't with him until he became a martyr. And so we have held up, and let me give you another name to include, Breonna Taylor, who we're still seeking justice for, and George Floyd, our modern day martyrs, still trying to get justice for them, but in a way that influences policy. Our concern, of course, is that now the states have been so emboldened that they can keep racist policies in place, even though there is federal and global pressure, right? That demands change. States like Louisville, where you can still get away with it, that wouldn't work in California. It wouldn't work in other states. And so our challenge now is, at the federal level, we will see some progress, but how do we get that down to the state and local levels so that we don't have to be like we were during Jim Crow times, where if I'm driving through California, I'm safe. If I drive through Texas, I better be careful. If I drive through Alabama, certain parts of Alabama, I better roll up my window and have the windows tinted. Or Mississippi, where I better not take that one long road that goes through those bushy areas. And some of you guys understand this, because it is true that some of those little areas of concern exist in Orange County as well, where you better not be seen in a place, on foot, on bike, or in a car, because you may encounter some trouble. So I don't know that we can put them next to each other to answer the question, but I do think that they have to be honored for the meaningfulness, right, of the moment.
The next one, I believe, is a comment more than a question. It's from Dr. Donna Opoku, and she says, on your point, when people say I had a rough upbringing too, I then ask, all of you, like many to most of us? And
yeah.
Go ahead, please.
I think I just want to encourage, we are not trying to monopolize suffering. Here's how you know you wrestle with privilege. If you have to compete for suffering acknowledgement. This is how you know. Well, I suffer too. Really? Are we going to have that conversation right now? Like, is it so important for you to be seen, for you to be acknowledged, that right in the middle of this conversation, you have to say, yep, I understand? Or is it possible for you to not be seen so that those who have historically been made to feel invincible or murdered or taken off the map or misjudged can have 100% of the stage so that they can be seen? You got to ask yourself that question. And this is an everyday normal conversation. In your attempt to positively relate, you have a sword in your hand, cutting down a tree or a house or a wall or a banner or a mural or a memorial that is trying to be erected so that nobody will ever forget what has occurred. So,
our next question is the conversation an event or a process? Does it have a goal? Does a post-conversation problem exist? And it follows by another question. So if you want me to read the two of them, or just go ahead and answer this one, please.
If you wouldn't mind, I'd like for you to repeat it because I want to make sure that I hear it correctly.
Sure. Is the conversation an event or a process? Does it have a goal? Does a post-conversation problem exist?
Yeah.
And then the following question is, whose problem is the problem? Black people, those other than Black, all of us? Let's omit from that question overtly racist people?
Yeah, see, I love, so just to the second question, I would love to take an opportunity, not necessarily now, but I would love to hear everyone's answer to that question. Because I think that question is answered at the soul level. Remember, we talked about this in the beginning, where it is that if your soul has not been disturbed, that's a major statement about where the problem is. Because it's true that we're all tied to a garment of destiny. I love it. I wish I could say it exactly how he said it in the tone that he said it. That's a quote from Dr. King, and it's not the exact quote. I paraphrased it. So I want to leave that in the lap of those who are attending to ask where the problem is. But I will say, if you can see the problem, then it is a problem. Does that make sense? Like, if you can see it, then it exists. And if you can't see it, okay. And to the conversation about an event, I'm 37 now. I don't think that I will see the end of this. I think that generations are already committed to wrestling with this. So then we have to, in my opinion, we have to modify our definition of success. And one of my mentors tells me all the time, if everybody does their little part, those summary, the summary, the collection of little parts, then informs a larger movement and a larger effort. And so I want to encourage this group that your little matters, that the influence and the hand and the impact that you can have is absolutely important. For the seeds that you plant might grow into a next president, right? Might grow into the next major influencer, might grow into the next thing that tips the scales in favor of justice, takes that arc and bends it even more. So.
Dr. Reverend, how about this question? Racism happens in every place of the world I have been. It seems to be a problem inside the people's soul. How do you change their souls? If the soul never dies, where does it go? And does it remember what happened to it?
Whew, let me tell you, that question is deeper than I am qualified to respond to. I'm not sure that I would use the same language. I've traveled the world, and I'm not sure that the way that we understand racism in the United States would be phrased the same way. So let me give some other words, like colorism, like the caste system, there is, have you guys, well, I think it was Carter G. Woodson who talks about the paper bag test and how the amount of melanin in your skin determines where you go. I was in another country, and literally across the road on what we would call the bay side, the water side, is where all the light-skinned people stayed. And inland, where the swamps were, where all the dark people stayed. And they literally didn't cross the road. And I was shook because I said, wow, this feels very, very familiar, but they didn't label it the same way. The darker skinned people were called gorilla, literally. And the lighter skinned people, I can't remember their name. So I'm not sure that I would phrase it the same way. This is why I think that our battle is at the soul level, though, because there is something in please allow me to use these words without being offensive. Well, let me try to find some different words. There is something in the intangible that gives us power to manipulate and to shift and to cause to change at that level. These are the I think, definitions of success that we are trying to get at. Where are the relationships where you feel like you have a soul connection? And I think that everybody, that's why, and so let me just go a little further, so that when there is trauma at the individual level, that trauma roots itself at the soul level. So then we may not be necessarily strategically implementing our resistance if we're not trying to figure out where the trauma happened at the soul level. So we can address that. Because if we address that, now the byproduct of that soul level injury will make its way back through the life of that person. And I think it will get rid of evil and get rid of hate and get rid of that other stuff. I'll tell you this, it's why, if I could just give a little bit of insight to some of the things, how I know this is true. So for those of you who don't know, I'm passionate about fathers and sons. I reconnected with my dad after 28 years, and it literally changed everything. But it was because that father-son relationship is a soul level thing, you see, because it had created something in me that I could not understand until I got to that soul level place. And so if life tells me that all I have to do is depend on my skills and my luck and my charisma and my smile, I will never get to the soul level place. If I stack up achievements, if I stack up money, if I build wealth, if I just stay out of trouble, I'll be all right. But there is this soul weight that is unaddressed. Then how can I really become who I was designed and created to be? And so once I began to do that work, it literally shifted all of the other things that I was involved in, right? And helped me to understand how I was unintentionally contributing to some of the isms, right, that our society has named and labeled and perpetuated. So I just think that has to be part of it. Everybody doesn't agree with me there, by the way. You know, some people just think that we just get directly to it. But I do believe that people are created with soul shaking relationships and ties that when they are addressed, particularly if they are severed or if they are injured, change happens.
Dr. Reverend Dorsey, I want to go on forever. And I don't know if we have time for one more question, even though it's going to be a long question and probably a long answer. Can I do it?
Sure, Rebecca. Do one more question.
I'll make my answer short.
Okay.
Perhaps the one about the form that reparations should take.
Okay, that's the question.
Yeah, so I had a conversation with some very, very wealthy people. They asked me the very same question. I explained to them that $10,000 is not the way to do it. I said, if you want to begin the reparation conversation, you have to give a permanent system of revenue. So somebody has to give something that produces lots of revenue away. So if it's a franchise, if it's a fund, if it's a, God, I can't remember what it's called. But if it's something that gives off a certain amount of money regularly and cannot be touched, but that money is then given to a community or a group in perpetuity. That's where reparations should begin. That's what land does, right? It just keeps on giving. You know, the Irvine company then allows UC Irvine to build on their property so long as they get 1% of all the income that comes through there forever. And I think that that's where it begins. But I think it's irresponsible to give people extra resource when you have not equipped them with mindsets to manage it. So you have to put something in a protected place that gives them permanent access while their minds and their souls and their emotions and their families are being dealt with. So I think that's the start of it.
Well, all I can say now is one word. Wow. Thank you so much, Stu. It's all yours. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Rebecca. Reverend Dr. Dorsey, I've got so many notes. The permanent system of revenue in perpetuity and protected, that's just so important. And I think we're all hoping that we will live up to being good trouble in the Laguna Woods Democratic Club and doing what we can to help everyone see the problem first, and that's part of what this program was supposed to be about. And it will definitely not be the last, because when we started the committee, we said, you know, better late than never, but really we should have done this years ago. And we thank you. We thank you for the work that you're doing with COR-AME. Huge thanks to Dr. Fran Williams for suggesting you as a speaker. And in the chat, people have already commented that they would like to have you speak to us again. And so maybe we'll make it a yearly event and ask you back again next time. And we all just have to keep thinking and never forgetting. And as you said, if we can wake up every morning, then we're not really, and saying this is a good day, then we're not really feeling the problem.
Yeah, if I can, please.
Please.
I just want, this is such a meaningful experience for me. Clearly, each of you has pockets of wisdom that have allowed people like myself to have these types of opportunities. I want to thank you for this privilege. I want to say to Dr. Fran and Dr. Donna, I hope that you guys are pleased, as I'm always trying to make sure that I represent our people well. And to those who are not as directly connected, I hope that this has been a respectful and thought-provoking encounter. We would certainly enjoy being invited to participate in some capacity again. And there are a suite of other voices that we may be able to introduce to continue to expand the conversation. But God bless you and thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And the club did have Dr. Whitlock as a speaker before. He was such a dynamic.
Unfair. Don't put me behind again. Put me first next time.
It was a while ago.
Indeed.
Okay. I think we're going to have to call the end to the program there. We thank everybody for being here today, and we're hoping that you will join us again next month on the Laguna Woods Democratic Club show on Village TV. Thank you very much for being with us.